Hi, I'm Roby.
And I'm Anu, and this is the Belonging Experiment.
Podcast where we explore the messy and beautiful journey of finding home while living abroad.
Welcome to our first
Yay!
episode. And
We,
before we launch into the first episode, Roby, I have a question for you. Did you do anything interesting in the last 1 week in your new home?
yeah, well, let me think. I did last Friday. We actually went to the local theater here. It's called the Mabel Tainter.
Ooh,
So it's actually a historical theater, and that's where we got married as well. That's the venue of our wedding.
wow.
And we watched The Little Prince. So one thing that was interesting is Kelly has not read the book. So this was, I said, like, I know. I was like, you've got to see this. But then I realized when we were both watching it, it was so difficult for him to follow it because he has not read the book. And you know how Little Princess, it's like a children's book, but it's actually for adults, and it's so philosophical and open for interpretation. But I did like because it was the book in itself, it's very challenging to put it into play. So I kind of like admired how they did that. And I think my overall key takeaway was just not never forget, to appreciate the little things. Yeah, so it's just going through the journey of like sometimes how adults they become so serious about life, right? And yeah, so yeah, it was a refreshing Friday evening for me. Yeah. Have you read the book
It's
though?
such a wonderful book. Yeah, it's such a wonderful book. And I think my shipment has not arrived, but it's I do have a copy in the shipment that is arriving soon, hopefully. So basically, the premise of the book is really good. And I was talking to somebody else and they said they haven't seen it and they haven't read it. And I didn't know how to react. But I don't know if you've been have you been to Busan?
No, no.
So in Busan, there's an entire town that they have painted
Oh my God.
with quotes from The Little
I'd love it.
Prince.
Yeah.
It's such a nice place to visit. There's a whole history behind that place and why it is the way it is. It's called the Gamcheon Culture Village. So before I went there, I mean, I didn't know too much about the artwork. I know there was artwork, but I didn't know too much
Right,
about it.
right.
But it was fully Little Prince inspired. So I think that's something that you should put on your travel itinerary for the future. Because
Yeah.
now that you've watched the show, you
I
will
think
really
so.
appreciate the
I'll
artwork.
appreciate it. Yeah. How about you? What? Tell me something interesting that you did last week.
Well, first of all, there's a huge storm raging outside. So if you hear any weird noises, and if you hear like the door slamming or like
I
the
hope
winds
not. I
howling,
hope not.
it's just the tempestado, as we say in Portuguese.
Impressing me
But
with
this
her
week
Portuguese.
I restarted my Portuguese classes. It's been like 3 months since I've been here, and I must say I've been getting away with a lot by not speaking. Thank you, Google Translate, for making me a
Yeah.
lazier
Yeah.
person. I was studying Portuguese when I was in Japan, but I feel like I wasn't really able to immerse myself into the topic because there's no day-to-day
Right.
usage, no opportunity for me to use it on a day-to-day
Right. Right.
basis. So I was like, I was studying and I have like all my notes and I have so much that I've studied and I'm like, wow,
You
I know
actually
quite a
did.
bit. I did. So I studied almost for like 8 months, but then the least I can do is like count 1 to 5, and then I'm like, what is six? It's hard. So I started, and when I started, I was looking on Instagram for inspiration, and then people are like, "Oh my God, Portuguese is so hard." I'm like, "Oh, maybe it's really hard." And then I'm like, "Wait a minute. If we could study Japanese
That's what I was about to say. It's
with
like,
with its three different scripts and what like three, I mean, of course we don't know 3,000 words, but we studied some kanji and some vocabulary. I'm like, Dude, if I can do
Yep,
Japanese,
yep,
I
yep,
I think Portuguese is cakewalk. So
yeah,
stop complaining and just get started already.
yeah,
So that was my week that went by. I need to commit to it.
yeah. You know,
And
yeah.
yeah.
Listening to your story, kind of like, I don't know if I'll feel lucky or I feel good, but I kind of like miss the challenge of like not understanding other people because it forces you to kind of like, oh, sumimasen, konnichiwa, and just try to relate, like really trying hard to assimilate. But now I'm in the US, so there's no challenge anymore that way. But yeah, I kind of miss, learning a new language too. I'm doing Duolingo though for French, so yeah.
Oh, please study French. Please study
Yeah. So that
French.
I could buy a
Dude,
croissant when I go to Paris.
it's croissant, by the way.
Croissant.
Um, sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, but you can get away with being cute in France, so don't worry about it.
Okay.
But yes, do learn French. It's a very sexy language. I immediately want to pounce on anybody who can speak French nicely.
Sure.
So yeah, it's a good thing. Anyway,
Anyway.
we are here for episode number 1, and the reason that we picked this, I have a story to tell.
Yeah.
So we moved to Japan in
Hmm.
2015, right?
Right.
And we made it a point to, in the first 1.5 years, to not visit Indian restaurants and to not think about going back home, because we knew, that's our comfort zone and it's a habit that you can very easily fall into. So we said nothing doing. Like worst case scenario, we do pizzas, but as
Right.
much as possible, we tried getting used to Japanese food. And I'm coming from a household where we cook food with a lot of amazing flavors. It was very hard to get into Japanese food. So we said, okay, we continue this way. So when I first decided to go to India, it was already, I think, a little more than a year and a half, almost two
Right.
years. And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to go back home. I'm so excited. Fast forward to 2022. I was in India for a very long time, as you know, almost like almost 6 months, Nairobi was in
Yeah,
India.
that was 6 months. Yeah.
Yeah. So at the end of it, I kind of wrapped up and I was coming back to Japan and I'm like, oh, it feels so good to go back home. And I'm like, when did that transition
I love
happen?
it. I love
because
it.
because it really hit me hard that I realized that going back from India, but I'm calling Japan my home, which kind of left me really, really perplexed. So that brings us to today's episode
Yes.
topic and the question: what is home and where is home? And how would you define this for yourself, Romy?
Yeah, yeah. No, I really love your story because I remember when you told me that I could instantly remember the feeling of like like when you arrive in the airport in Japan, right? And then you start hearing Japanese, and then you start craving personally I always crave for a typical Japanese breakfast when I'm back, like just the healthy ones, like with the miso
Really?
soup and with the fish and the rice. I don't know, because yeah, I mean, Filipino food is great, but I just love this, like just the healthy, simple Japanese breakfast. I don't know. That's what I always miss. Or a ramen. Depends on the time of the day that I arrive in the airport. Yeah, so I guess yeah, to answer, like to we wanna discuss first what really makes a place home, right? Because with that experience that we had, it kind of like redefines what is home, right? So one thing that came to my mind is and this actually made sense when I listened to one of the podcasts which talks about a similar topic of what is really home. And I like the line there where he said that home is where you are growing. So it really resonated to me because I felt like why Japan felt like home to me is because that was the time where I felt like I was really growing. I was discovering myself. When I was back in the Philippines, I had a different definition of success. Like to me, success would mean, oh, I'll reach the VP level, and I have this car, and I have this house. And when I moved to Japan, I was living in like a 30 square meter apartment, and I was so happy. And yeah, so I think yeah, that place where you are growing, right? And you're discovering yourself. Yeah. What is it for you? Like what comes into
When
your
I
mind?
when I was leaving for Japan, we were staying in this house that I grew up in, and we had like a really nice terrace, and I had a really nice setup going. I would go to work and come back, and we had help for the kitchen who would come in, and she would make our dinner and do like prep the next day. And whenever we had friends coming in, we always had extra for friends. And we had like a nice car. We didn't really have like a major debt or anything at that time. We were comfortable. We had a nice set of friends. We had a schedule. I had a decent job, and I was constantly growing. And I think of it now after you said what you said to say, and I think at that time I was 29. Yeah, I was 29 at that time. And I said, my God, I'm set in life. Like, this is
Yeah,
it.
this is life.
Like, I'm at the pinnacle of my life. This is it. But now when I look back, I was like, my goodness, for me personally, not to say to
Right,
anybody who's listening to
right,
this, not to say that, that is limiting, but for myself, if I had restricted myself to that mindset and to say this is what I come back to at the end of the day, I guess it's not a bad option, but I do like my current option much, much better. And I
right.
think it makes a lot of sense to say home is where you grow.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
such an important
Right, right,
thing, which means it's a place of constant discomfort, not
right,
necessarily always your safe space, but there is certain discomfort, but there is also some sort of a safety
right.
in your discomfort, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
And I think, like when you're trying to describe it, it almost feels like home is a feeling, right? Like it's home is
Mm.
something that you should not be pressured. It should be cozy. You should be yourself. Because there are homes that, when you visit other homes, it feels like it's very I can't be myself here. Like I have to be something or someone else when I enjoy the spaces of other people. But does it also mean that, do you have an idea of like home is in terms of a physical form? And what I'm trying to say is to me, I would define home with like plants, for instance. It feels like it's very homey for me if there is plants around and if it's not cluttered because I think I grew up personally with a very cluttered home. And so when I moved out of my parents' house, I feel like I just want to make sure everything is not cluttered because I didn't want that anymore. I don't want clutter in my house.
It's funny that you say that because growing up for me, our home was very clean. Like you
Oh,
can't spot dust in the house
oh,
anywhere.
oh.
But the house will be cluttered. Like we had a lot of things.
Yes, yes.
So it was then, and my bedroom would be like a pigsty. Because I hated doing laundry as a kid. Now I'm like laundry queen. But as a kid, I hated doing
Yeah,
laundry. I'm
sure.
like, my God, do I need to put everything back? But now, for me, to define it from a physical sense, it needs to be open, it needs to be
Right.
airy, it needs to be spacious. I'm very particular about the kitchen overflowing into the living
Yeah,
room,
yeah,
plants, a lot of books.
yeah. You
Yeah,
love reading books.
I can't think of anything.
I still remembered like
Reading, looking,
I still
looking at
remembered
them
like
at
your
least.
shelves in Japan where you have like just books, books, books.
I spent a lot of money on those. They were so they were so expensive. Like for me in India, I used to get books in second-hand
Yeah,
places
I love
for
I love
like
it too. Yeah.
20 rupees, which is like 50 yen, 50 yen,
Oh my
less than
God.
50 yen, 30 and 40 yen. And then I come here and it's like, here it's like what, 14 euros. And I'm like, oh, 14 euros. And a hardback is like 25 euros. And in Japan, it was as much. So I was like, oh my God, this is how I spend my money.
About home being, being a feeling, right? Also a feeling of like where you're growing. It could be a physical space. But what I'm also hearing from you is that maybe our definition of home could also change depending on the phase of our lives, right? So when we were younger, we had a different definition. And then when we move to the next milestone, it could also be a different definition. And yeah, I think my next question for us is, and I think this will be very interesting. When someone asks you, where are you from? How do you answer this question? Like, without thinking, what is your answer?
I stop. I just stare. I'm like, well, I was in this situation recently. I was telling you, right? So somebody's like, introduce yourself. And I'm like, I'm Anu. I'm from Japan. And they're like, you what? And I'm like, well, I've been living in Japan the last 10 years of my life. And then they're like, where are you really from? I'm like, I'm not a Japanese passport holder, right? I'm like, I'm from
Sure.
India. And they're like, oh. And then they're like, so you're here from Japan? I'm like, no, I'm here from Portugal. And they're like, oh, are you visiting? I'm like, no, I think I kind of live there now. So my introduction is long, but like you said, it's a feeling again. So I think that comes back to why do I keep going to Japan? Because my functioning bank accounts
Right.
are still in Japan. My
Right.
credit card is Japanese. My debit card is Japanese. And if I now say, oh, like, what is your home address? The first thing that I type is Japanese address because
Yeah.
that's I'm not registered here. I'm still registered in some way
Right.
to
Right.
Japan. So from a technical perspective, I guess my home is still Japan, but then I guess for all practical purposes, this is my home in
Right.
Portugal. How do you identify yourself?
I think I would instantly answer to like, yeah, I came from Japan because that's kind of like the recent country, right? Like, and to be fair, like we've spent 10 years there, and that was 10 years of our lives in our 30s too, late 20s, 30s. That's really the time when you start really earning, you're financially stable, like so these are really the pinnacle of your adulthood, let's say. So I think it really influences us a lot when we say like, where's home? That's Japan. And then you get a stare like what you said, like, and I think they wanted to be polite. It's like, well, you don't look like a typical Japanese. And then that's when I see that face, I would instantly say, oh, I'm originally from the Philippines, but I've lived in Japan for so I think that's now my line. Like, oh, I'm originally from the Philippines, but I lived in Japan for the last 10 years, and now I'm here. I think that creates a clarification at the beginning of like, okay, let me answer this for you. Okay, I'm not Japanese, but I identify living in Japan. And you've mentioned too about, some of our documents are still in Japan. Like I actually got my permanent residency while I was in Japan. So I still maintain that. So I guess I'm holding on to it. And I think I'm not sure if I'm still kind of like trying to move on because we really had good experience in Japan, and Japan has been so good to us, and I'm not sure if I'm even over it or if I will be over it. So I think this is something that we will find out as we live our new lives here in our the third country now that we've moved to. I have a question in my mind, like, do you think we can have multiple homes at the same time? Like, I'm still proud to be a Filipino, right? But I also call Japan my home. But now I'm married here in the US. So do you think we could have multiple homes at the same time? Like,
It's interesting that you should ask that because not to go into a historical lesson or
Mm-hmm.
anything, there's a lot of cultural connection
Connection.
between India and Portugal, especially from the south of India. I see a lot of home here and I see a lot of Portugal back in India. So for me, it's emotionally, I think one of the reasons the transition has been easier for me is because it reminds me so much of like the Portuguese tiles. We have something very similar
Yeah, yeah,
back in India. We do have something called the Atangudi tiles, which is
yeah.
very particular to this area in the south of India. So for me, these kind of things make it easier to acclimatize to Portugal. But I always say that, this is probably my third life. My first life, I was a Korean. My second life, my second life, I was probably a French soldier killed on British soil. And in my third life, I am who I am because I have very strong, emotionally, I feel very strongly when I think about France or I think about Seoul. And in that sense, I feel
Right.
for me, it's very emotional.
Mm.
How, and what is it for you?
Yeah, I like that sharing you did because you feel, sometimes it's very possible that you assimilate with a certain country, but you don't have any connection to it. And I've heard that a lot from people who maybe they have not really moved to a different country, but I have a lot of friends who love Japan. And it's just like, and they've never lived there, right? They visit because it's very near, but also they know the culture even more than I do, I feel like sometimes, because I think they just study it. They really assimilate to the country. So I think it's also possible that you've never lived in a certain country, but you really have a strong connection to that country, as what you've mentioned. For me, I think I just got comfortable calling different places my home. Yeah, my homes, let's say. I think you will go through a phase though of like getting lost at the beginning. For me, when I transitioned from the Philippines to Japan, the first few years that I've been going home to the Philippines, I still call Philippines as like this is home, this is home. And then I think it was on my fifth year in living in Japan. And then when I went home, I have no friends there anymore. My brothers were not even there anymore. I only visit because my parents are still there. And it was kind of lonely. And I think the question that I had in my mind was, I think home should not be a sad place. And that's why I think I started redefining maybe this is not home anymore. And so I got
Wow, that's
confused.
painful.
Yeah, right? Like I got confused like I'm just going home because I wanted to see my parents who are aging, but I didn't yeah, I went alone and so I think I got after that experience I got comfortable. You know what? I don't have to just say Philippines is my only home. Japan could also be my home. So I think I got comfortable with that for sure. Yeah.
Anyway, just to summarize what I'm trying to see if we can give a conclusion. So if we define where is home, I think I can very safely summarize and say that it's not one place.
Yeah.
It's where we grow, where we feel safe. It's what we redefine for ourselves. And I guess what we continue to carry with us in terms
Right.
of a new thought process and emotion.
Right.
I guess that's what really home is.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm sure, I feel like we're not the only ones feeling this too. I'm sure there's a lot of people who have moved countries. And maybe you have not
Mm.
moved to a different country, but you've moved to a different community in the same city, or you moved to different cities in the same country. And this could be a multiple versions of changes in your lives. And I think you could also feel this too. Like you suddenly feel like disconnected, and then you try to find a new home, and it could be ever changing depending on the season that you're in as well. So I'm sure our listeners over there have their own versions of the stories that we're telling. So, yeah, if you guys have something similar or maybe different, right? We want to hear from you. So, wherever you're listening, just put in the comment, message us in Instagram. We'd love to hear your story as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe their input would also help us define home better
Yeah.
for ourselves and definitely help me have a shorter self-introduction. So,
Yeah. Like, I'm Anu, just me.
anyway, I think it's time for us to wrap up and also
Yeah.
introduce the next episode. What do you think?
I think
Shall
so.
I tell the
Yes.
listeners?
What is our next
Okay.
episode?
So, in the next episode, we are going to be talking about our very, very messy departure from Japan. When I mean messy, we've been planning the departure, of course, for a very, very long time, but we would like to share with the listeners our funny, sad, happy stories connected to our departure from Japan. So please join us to listen into our struggles, to listen into our happy moments
Yeah. Our
in our next
goodbyes.
episode.
So, if you guys enjoyed our first episode, make sure to subscribe and follow us. And see you next time. And this is the Belonging Experiment. Thank you.